what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi friends, welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. Today we have a great interview with Mel Cassidy. Mel is the author of Radical Relating, a queer and polyamory-informed guide to love beyond the myth of monogamy. Mel was a presenter at this year's annual Anarchist Book Fair in Victoria, BC. They gave a great presentation that a lot of the people at the book fair really loved. And so afterwards, I emailed Mel and I asked them to come on the podcast and talk more about their book, about their experiences, about their very interesting life, which we were talking about a little bit before recording, which I find fascinating, and just about their theories of love and politics and all that fun stuff. And Mel agreed. So, well, Mel, welcome to Seeds of Revolution. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Joel.
My pleasure. So maybe you could start off by just introducing yourself to our audience, for those of them who haven't had the good fortune of reading any of your work yet. Sort of, where do you come from? What are you doing? How'd you get to where you are? Sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, let me start with what I do, and then we'll probably get to where I come from. I'm a somatic relationship coach. I work with the queer and questioning, and those who love them, who are exploring consensual non-monogamy. So that can look like polyamory. That can also look like open relationships, relationship anarchy, so forth. And I'm polyamorous in my own life, and I'm queer. I'm non-binary, and I also am a third culture kid, which I'm learning more and more is such an interesting identity to hold. It means you're born in one culture, raised in another, and now live in a third. And I like to tell people that because I think it's important to note that, like, I'm not taking any particular cultural lens as this is the be all and end all of how to be in life.
What culture were you raised in? What culture are you in now? What culture were you born in? I think that's really interesting. If you could talk a little bit more about
Yeah.
the
So I'm
third.
actually I'm actually a second generation third culture kid. So my mom, her family's very complex. Her mother's family were Romani Greek, from the Ottoman Empire, which goes into some interesting politics, you know.
Especially these
Um,
days.
yeah. And then her family moved to Venezuela during the Greek Civil War. So she was culturally, she's Latina. And then she immigrated to Canada as a young adult.
I actually read on your website that on your matrilineal line, you are the first in 6 generations who has not been a refugee.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I find that incredible, and especially in this day and age, not just with Trump's horrific anti-immigrant policies, but, the Liberals just dropped their budget, and Canada is going through its own anti-immigrant spasm. How does somebody with your family experience, with your maybe epigenetic history, how do you relate to what is happening now with this anti-immigrant panic, both
Oh,
in
yeah.
North America and sort of around the world?
Yeah. I mean, it breaks my heart. There's a Romani saying that borders are scars upon the earth.
That's a great saying.
And
I gotta write that
yeah,
down. I'm gonna steal that from you, Mel. That's a great saying.
yeah, you can absolutely quote. I mean, it's a Romani saying, right? And I think that it's so poignant. And the Romani peoples, a lot of people don't understand who we are, or that we still exist, or that we are such a diaspora. Um, our ancestors came from northern India and left. We believe because of persecution and, cultural differences, as is always the case, and just became nomadic, wandering through South Asia, through the Levant and Arabia, and then some eventually into Europe. And were enslaved in some places in Europe and then taken to the Americas. And there's a long, long, complex history, which I am by no means an expert in. I'm still learning and unpacking it. But I think of that history of diaspora. You are displaced, not necessarily through your own agency, but through a necessity to survive. And, when we see people coming in as immigrants and refugees, there's a necessity for survival. Survival was not tenable where somebody was. And, I do have the stats in the book. I talk about this that like by 2050, it's expected so much of the world's population will have been displaced because of global climate change and other catastrophes. And we are seeing more and more displacement as we get closer to that time. And when we're not, making plans for how we support each other globally in that way, when we're getting into this like power hoarding mentality of like, no, our borders stay closed, I think we're really losing out on something. When my grandfather immigrated to Canada, he did so with a lot of privilege. He had established himself as a really fantastic civil engineer, working in South America, and then he had applied to work in the U.S. But this is during the McCarthy days, and because he had been best friends with the leader of the Greek Communist Party in the
I was
40s,
kind of a non-starter.
he was not allowed.
Yeah.
And so he's like, "Well, let's try Canada." And so Canada, brought him in, and they brought him in for his expertise. They brought him in because he was highly skilled, and, he helped build a lot of the hydro dams that still to this day power, BC. And this is the thing, when people talk about like, "Oh, we don't want immigrants coming into the country," I'm like, "You're losing so much." You're losing so much in terms of skill, but you're also losing what people culturally bring because, we are such a diverse world. And I say this knowing I have the privilege to have traveled a lot and to have lived in different cultures and to have studied and absorbed different cultures in terms of like, being immersed in different cultural spaces. And when we can understand that there's not a single way to do things, I think um, we grow to be more enriched in our human experience. I think there's even more joy to be found. And I think the consequences of not having space for immigration and movement between land and culture and places, I think the cost of that is that we get rigid and we think my way is the only way, which of course is white supremacy, right? And, also when we're looking at migration, we have to look at like, how do we migrate in a way that is honoring and respectful and not exploitative because, colonialism, we don't want that migration to just become another version of colonialism. Like when we see people, leaving North America and going to like Bali or moving to Mexico or right, like, migrating to the global south because of the lower cost of living, we have to be mindful, are we just replicating colonialism when we do that? And I think and there's a more nuanced conversation in there, but you asked me what my thoughts were on all of this, and yeah, I think it boils down to the borders are, there's a necessity for governance and resource management. And also, as human beings, we benefit tremendously from cross-cultural exposure and from being able to learn from each other in that way.
It's interesting hearing you talk about your family's experiences with immigration and your beliefs on immigration and borders, and I'm curious how that has, if it has, affected your conceptualization of relationships,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and especially the idea of displacement. Like how have you brought, if you have brought that concept of displacement and maybe othering as a result of displacement into your conception of monogamy or polyamory?
Yeah. So I was born in the UK, and I hold British citizenship, but it's not an identity that I resonate with. I was always an outsider because my mom was foreign, right? And as I describe it, the British mentality, it tends to be racism within shades of whiteness.
That's very good. And you're dropping some bombs, Mel. I like this.
And, thanks. And so I always felt like I was peculiar. And, on top of that, my mother practiced a form of spirituality from India. So then it was like another layer of like cultural distance from my
I'm
peers.
just I sorry to interrupt, but I'm very curious. Given that's what's going on in the UK today, did your mother experience, to what extent, I should say, did she experience backlash or racism or prejudice practicing these religious beliefs of hers that, today in parts of the UK, they're rioting over?
I don't think the spiritual beliefs were necessarily the cause, like, they didn't really bleed into any of the overt racism. Like, a lot of what I would experience my mom getting was, like, I mean, when we would travel to the US, she would always be stopped and questioned because my mother just happens to be a doppelganger for, Layla Khalid, who is a member of the Palestinian
Yeah.
Liberation
Yeah,
Organization, and, like,
LP, absolutely. Yeah,
and,
the hijacker.
like, when I say doppelganger, like, in the '70s, my mom was arrested and accused of being her.
Um, that's a whole another podcast I wanna have. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Um, and, so, like, I would experience it in things like that, and she would get, she suffered from chronic fatigue, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and was gaslit a lot by doctors, and, I mean, every woman who suffered from a chronic illness knows what that gaslighting is like, but a lot of the dismissal was in the form of, "You're just looking for attention, you silly foreigner."
Makes sense.
And so then, her yoga practice and turning to, things like Ayurvedic medicine was what supported her through that when the National Health Service was failing to support people. And so that was just like, "Oh, yeah, that's odd, that's peculiar, that's different, that's weird." The apartment smells weird because of the spices that you're using. And so, like, my friends would come over and there would be this kind of like, "Melina's mom is weird," kind of thing. I don't remember consciously experiencing that as racism towards my mom when I was younger. It's one of those things where as I got older, I looked back on it and I was like, "Huh, what was going on there?" Like, what
Did you
was
ever
it
have a
the
conversation with her about it?
No,
Oh,
no, and, I no, and I think it's to me, it's telling that the people I maintained the best friendships with, like, and we're talking when I was a little kid in England, were people who were not totally English, who were, had some kind of mixed background as well. And then when we moved to the Middle East, when we moved to Kuwait, everything changed for me. In Kuwait, and Kuwait is a complex country. More than half the population are expats. It's a country that still, I think, very much exists on like tribal class um, structures. My dad would describe it as living in many different centuries at the same time. And so you have a very interesting, what I would say, like the skilled working middle class of, university educated professionals, who are from Europe and from North America and also from Africa and through Asia and Australia too. And um, it's a cultural melting pot in that way. So, going to an international school in Kuwait, I got to be around so many different cultures, and suddenly I wasn't weird
hmm.
because there was no norm. Right? There was definitely, like, it was a British curriculum school, we had to do the English stuff and stuff, but amongst my friends, there was no, like, "Well, this is the norm, this is what everyone does, and you're not doing it that way, so you must be weird." It was more of a curiosity of like, "Oh, I guess that's how your people do that. Okay, cool."
That's so interesting. Do you think that was because in that context, sort of everybody was an outsider?
Yeah,
So when everybody is an outsider, there are no outsiders.
absolutely.
That's
Absolutely, it was that. And what's interesting when you live in an expat environment, there's, I think, different ways that people go about creating community. I think some people will kind of there's a kind of like stick with your own kind of mentality. And people will be like, "Oh, we'll just live in the compound with other expats who are just like us." And my mom was adamant, "We are not living in a compound. We are not doing that." And so we lived in a villa that was owned by our landlord who lived next door, who was Kuwaiti and had, this family had been in his house for many decades. Um, and building community for me was about finding all the other weirdos. And I remember very clearly at school feeling I feel a little bit socially awkward, but here's all the other socially awkward people. Let's all hang out together. And what's interesting when I think about like my earliest experiences in non-monogamy were in Kuwait. Um, I remember when we were looking for a place to live, going to one house and meeting a gentleman who introduced us to his two wives. And that was my first ever experience that, oh, this is something people do. Like as a kid, I'd had make believe stories about having multiple husbands, and my mom had been like, no, 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 you can't do that.
now.
And, and,
So
and
go ahead. Go ahead. I'll save my question.
Well, and so it was like, "Oh, that's a thing people do? That's really interesting to me." And then, as a teenager, teenagers, we like to explore, we like to experiment. And I crushed on so many people, but I didn't wanna date anyone because I thought if I was to date somebody, I would have to stop myself from crushing on all those other people. And I had so much more fun being friends with all the people I crushed on, and then, we get together for parties on the weekend, and we play spin the bottle, and we play truth or dare, and I get to make out with people. And in my last year of high school, I talk about this in the book. I had an experience of reconnecting with an ex, and we just carried on the relationship even though he was dating someone in another school. So it was not honest non-monogamy, I wanna be clear about that. It was very much dishonest and messy. But there was, a sense in myself of like, this is something I'm actually excited about. I'm not jealous that he's dating this other girl. I'm actually really happy for him and that, he's getting something there that isn't something I could offer. Um, and I think that kind of set the, kind of yeah, it set a baseline for me of like, "Oh, that's actually an experience I wanna have in my relationships where I'm not being possessive over my partner's affections. I really wanna be, expansive about the way that I relate." And I had no idea how to do that at the time and no words for that. Um, yeah.
When you first came into awareness that there was such a thing as non-monogamy, was that in the context of observing Kuwaiti methods of organizing love and relationships?
Um
That among the expat community? And 'cause and I wanna, I'll telegraph where I'm going, because I think, if we were to look at it from the context of Orientalism, of an
Mm,
Edward
mhm.
Said approach, then they might say, well, these Western conceptions of non-monogamy in the East are fatally infected with ideas of patriarchy, ideas of
Right.
non-consent, and that non-monogamy equates to, the inherent oppression of women by, a male ruling class. And I'm curious if when you encountered non-monogamy in a Kuwaiti setting, how was that informed by this Orientalist approach that you maybe were not, thankfully, as infected by because you were growing up in Kuwait as those of us who were growing up in North America were when we were, indoctrinated with these false concepts of what life in the Middle East must be like.
I mean, I certainly got that from my mom of like, "No, it's not okay that they're doing this." But I would say I had a sense of open relationships vaguely because, I'd read about the '70s. I'd heard stories. And it just wasn't a sense of like, oh, that could be something long-term sustainable. I will say I had the joy of meeting so many amazing Kuwaiti feminists when I lived in Kuwait. And Kuwaiti feminists are a force to be reckoned with. I feel very grateful that that was my introduction to feminism. And,
What's the
you know
difference? Like, what's the headline difference if you're talking about
Ooh.
experiences with Kuwaiti feminists versus Canadian or, US feminists?
I think there's a kind of passion that, that we don't quite get as much here. And I don't know that I would be qualified to, like, really speak in more depth to that, but I think, like, if you look at the intersection of queer and feminist activism within the Middle East, and I would say so it's not just Kuwaiti, I'd say it's probably true throughout Arabia and the Levant. Um, when you are having to figure these things out in the midst of a society that is very oppressive, I think there's a kernel of truth that comes through. It's kind of like, the diamond is formed under pressure kind of feeling. And, in Kuwait, for example, like when we would do plays at school, they would go through censorship. Um, and sometimes you'd be like, why did they censor this line? And I remember we did Steel Magnolias, and there's a line about something being as pink as a pig that got cut.
'Cause it's not halal.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And then we're like, "Okay, could we say pink is something else?" Like, and so, like, when you're living with that kind of, censorship, you really get, I think, more clear, and you also learn how to, like, subvert things in a different way. I think in North America, we have labored under the illusion of freedom.
Mm,
And so I think what's happening right now is like there has been so much shock around how those perceived freedoms have been taken away. And of course, I look at it and I'm like, well, were we ever that free here? We talk about freedom of speech, but is there actually freedom of speech? There has always been censorship of some kind. Um, and so yeah, that I think is a difference. And I'm not saying that like it's better or worse. It's just it's different. Um, so going back to, like, the your question around, like, the exposure to non-monogamy that I had in the Middle East, like, going back to, like, meeting that man and his 2 wives, I was fascinated. I mean, I was 13 years old, and I was like, "This is different." And what stuck in my memory about that experience was that these 2 women got along, and they seemed to genuinely love each other. And I've gone back in later years and gone, "Well, what's going on there?" And people in North America and in Europe, like, we talk about this term of ethical non-monogamy, and people do that because they wanna say, like, "It's not cheating, we're not doing this to hurt anyone's feelings, it's not about being deceptive or secretive or having a side piece or affairs or anything like that." The putting the ethical there is to signify that we're doing this in a way that hopefully is, kind and consensual. But what I find is problematic is that ethics are so culturally subjective
mm,
because and this is where my cultural experiences come into play in terms of my own bias. I think that, in the Middle East, the ethics of non-monogamy function very differently from how the ethics of non-monogamy function in North America. In a patriarchal society, the way that you find stability and safety and security is through supporting the patriarchy or is through allying yourself with patriarchy. And even if you want to subvert it, you have to find a way to be in allyship to it to survive when it's at a certain level of oppression. And so for some women, that is a huge relief. And you look at culturally why the practices of plural marriages, if have been there. And let's be clear, most of the world practiced plural relationships before colonialism from Europe. Um, it is about improving your access to resources. It's about enhancing the safety and security that you experience. Before Islam, there is plenty of evidence that plural marriages were not just patriarchal, one man and multiple women. that one woman can have multiple husbands. And of course, there was lots of queer relationships in the mix as well. And so, this is people will say like, oh, it's some kind of like they get Islamic phobic about it and like, oh, it's this patriarchal thing and it's all about control. And sure, that's going to happen. Just like that happens in monogamous relationships in the West. You can have a man being abusive to his monogamous wife. Like the structure of the relationship isn't what makes it abusive. It's the way people treat each other in the relationship. There's when we look at how we deconstruct why do we have relationships? Why do we seek out partnership? You know, if we're living, depending on the systems that we're living in, that partnership could be so important for our survival. I think of my great grandmother who, arrived in northern Greece with a newborn baby and another young child. Her husband had been shot in a genocide. All the men in her family had been killed in this genocide. She had her sisters, she had her mom, she had a whole family to support, and she had nothing. And so she chose to get married again. And she got married to the first man who seemed half decent, who turned out to be not so decent and was abusive and was abusive to her previous children. And so like but she did that for survival. And I don't fault her for doing that for her survival. That was the system she was in. As a single mother, she had to do that to get resources.
It's
And yeah.
it's interesting what you said about pre-Islamic conceptions of non-monogamy, and I'm wondering if you think there's a link between monogamy and monotheism, and what monogamy or polyamory would look like if it weren't for sort of what I would say the radical monotheism that, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have all evolved into.
Interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. There's probably a relationship there. Um, yeah. I mean, I say this as someone who like I think there is truth at the root of every spiritual tradition in the world, and every spiritual tradition gets twisted by dogma. Um,
'Cause I'm just thinking,
yeah,
even in Christianity, there was hundreds of years when priests could get married and
yep.
when priests had wives and mistresses. And it wasn't only until, the dogma of Christianity became so concentrated in the Vatican and so patriarchal, top down and hierarchical that we also saw these manifestations of radical, either enforced monogamy when it came to married people who were abiding by the strictures of the Catholic Church,
Mm.
or radical forced quote unquote celibacy when it came to Catholic priests. And so I don't know. I just wonder if there's a link there somewhere.
I think what the link might be is certainly when we're looking at like Christianity is that monogamy creates a sense of separation. So we look at attachment theory, and the way that we understand attachment theory in modern day is that, oh, as a child, whether your caregivers were present with you or not present with you affects how you experience attachment as an adult. Okay, fair. But we didn't grow up, we didn't evolve as a species in the nuclear family model of a child being raised by just two parents. We evolved as a species in community, in tribal structures and villages where no infant would have been left alone for too long, where there was always entrusted adults around and everybody took part in taking care and raising the children. And we see this still to this day in cultures that have maintained their tribal traditions, that this is how children tend to be raised. The enforcement
Mhm.
of monogamy as a way to say, "No, you are now siloed in your coupled up unit, and your child is only gonna be raised by you," creates an immediate sense of separation and isolation. And in that sense of isolation, we are more easily controlled, right? And we see this in modern day, the invention of the nuclear family, I think is like I think the enforcement of monogamy was part of colonialism, and then we have like this creation of the nuclear family. And the nuclear family was absolutely designed to separate us. It was this response to, oh my gosh, World War II, people are interested in socialism now. People might want to share their resources instead of being, good capitalists. And oh my God, women want to have equal rights as men. Let's get women back into the home. Let's repurpose our factories from making munitions into making toasters. Let- Let's separate people from their sense of community and their sense of relationality with each other so that we can maintain this hierarchical order and system. So I think that's where, going back to like the monotheistic religions, where we see monogamy come in as part of religious dogma, it's also coming in as part of colonialism. It's also coming in as part of this like power grab. And how do we hold power over our followers or the people who are serving us?
It's interesting you're talking about the formation of these bound, strict monogamous communities, these nuclear family units. And I was looking at your blog, and you write some very interesting things about different waves of feminism. And
Mhm.
talking about first wave feminism, you talked a little bit about non-monogamous commune building, and using examples like the Oneida community from
Yeah.
1914. And I was wondering, because I have a vague passing familiarity with some of those utopian communities. And I was wondering why you think those sorts of non-monogamous communities, even though a lot of them went through periods of really incredible flourishing, eventually they, either fell apart or they became much smaller, or just for whatever reason didn't seem to work out for as much time and in the way that their founders wanted them to. And so I was wondering if you could maybe comment on why that sort of non-monogamous commune building, at least in North America, wasn't, seemingly to my amateur historian's eye, as successful as I imagine the founders of those communities would have wanted them to be.
I mean, it's the same reason why they fall apart today. It's a lack of conflict intimacy.
Can you talk
Um,
a little bit about what you mean by that?
yeah. So this idea of conflict intimacy is that we can hold conflict. So we can have different ideas or different desires or different needs or different strategies for meeting those needs. And it doesn't mean that we can't be in connection.
Mhm.
That through understanding our differences, appreciating our differences, we can actually come back into some form of relationship. And I mean, I think conflict intimacy is the most crucial skill for the survival of the planet right now. For being able to understand each other. Right now we've gotten so polarized, right? And it becomes so hard to engage with someone whose ideas are different because we're kind of in the algorithm bias bubbles. And and it's a conscious effort, right, to get yourself out of that. But it feels comfortable to be around people who you're like, oh, we're so alike. And a lot of those early communes and still to this day, a lot of, I think, utopian commune experiments, come together because they're like, "We have a shared vision. We have a shared vision. Let's live in peace. Let's share resources. Let's make it easier for all of us." Great. Who would say no to that? Sounds wonderful. And we're human beings. Human beings are not perfect. Human beings are fundamentally messy. And I think within Western culture, we've gotten very indoctrinated into the ideas of perfectionism and expecting perfection of people, even in activist spaces, right? We expect
Oh, well, that's certainly true.
we
I
expect
have firsthand
perfection,
experience with that.
and like I think we have to differentiate between being messy and going out of our way to do harm. I'm not saying we should go out of our way to do harm, but I think we need to acknowledge that as human beings, we're going to trip up over each other and we're going to shit's going to hit the fan. And that's part of being human. So for a lot of these commune experiences, there was always this like, we have to be perfect. We have to be perfect. We have to be perfect. And perfection is part of white supremacy, right? It's one of those parts that we internalize and we don't even realize how much we've internalized it. And and that shows up in the like, well, there's one right way to do things. And so you
And if you
have
don't do
these,
that, you're off. You're literally out of the commune.
yeah, you're voted off the island, you're gone. And so as soon as someone trips up in their own humanity, they threaten the stability of that perfection, right? And I think of perfectionism as kind of like a house of cards. Like, yeah, if you have every single card in exactly the perfect place with exactly the right balance, yeah, sure, you can build a beautiful big structure. But the moment one of them gets knocked off balance, everything falls apart.
That's interesting. And hopefully this next question ties more directly into your book, because I do want to spend some time talking about your book and I want people to go out and buy it. How do we practice getting better at conflict intimacy?
Yeah. I think part of that lies in understanding our own trauma responses. So, this term trauma responses gets thrown around as a bit of a buzzword. So, trauma is basically when things are overwhelming beyond our ability to cope with. So, sometimes you have the resources and you can cope with hardship and it doesn't leave you with trauma. But while you're in the midst of stressful experiences, your nervous system is going to very naturally respond in a way to try and keep you safe. The ways that it can respond to try and keep you safe are to assert yourself, right? Gonna state my boundaries. I'm gonna be louder. I'm gonna share what I need. I'm gonna get bigger in my voice. I'm gonna take up more space, right? That's self assertion. And sometimes that can go as far as getting into a fight, but it doesn't have to go there. There's also self-preservation, which is, "Ah, shit, this is scary. I'm just gonna leave. I'm just not gonna say anything. I'm just gonna, like, be quiet about my discomfort." And that's a totally reasonable response, right? That's our flight response, and so we just learn to shut it down. There's also when we just go into overwhelm and we fade out and that freeze response, right? We're bamboozled, we're baffled, we don't know how to engage, and we dissociate. And when we dissociate, we're disconnecting from ourselves. The way I look at it is that we connect with our hearts and our feelings. We connect with our mind and our ideas. We connect with our body, our embodied experiences of being a being moving through this earth. And we also connect or don't connect with spirit, which I would define as like everything that is beyond the sum of ourselves, right? Um, and when we dissociate, we disconnect those different parts of ourselves. And dissociation means that well, if I'm going around just being in my head and never actually connecting with my feelings, I'm losing a part of my relationality with other people. Similarly, if I'm going around just being a big ball of feelings all the time and never engaging in my rational mind, I'm also losing out on some relationship. And so that's one of the things that's getting in the way of us experiencing conflict intimacy, right? Because when we are dissociated, we're not even relating to ourselves, let alone to others. And then the other thing that happens when we
I would have to think that smartphones and social media just make this dichotomy, this division exponentially.
oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think so. And then the other response that we have when we experience this stress is we go into appeasement. We try to, if we experience that someone is in a position of power over us or a situation is in position of power over us, we go, how do I suck up? And part of that is because we know that we're risking dissociation, or we know that we've dissociated on some level, and we're trying to fake our way back into connection, or we're trying to make a bid to stay in connection. So this is when we go into fawning and people pleasing. This might also be where we try to flirt our way out of a situation that feels stressful. It might also look when we try to fixate on things and obsess over them because I've got to find the solution. I've got to make my partner happy because if they're not happy, the sky will fall and everything will collapse, right? There's all sorts of strategies that we can use in there. And the thing is, most of these things play out unconsciously. We don't realize that that's what we're doing. And we also don't often feel received in them. right? I think one of the challenges in Western culture, particularly in, like white Western culture in North America, is we don't have a lot of capacity for dealing with argument. We don't have a lot of capacity for
At least
passion.
not productively.
Yeah. And I this again is one of those places where cultural experiences come into play. If you ever are at an international airport and there's a flight arriving from Greece, you can tell when the Greeks are coming out of the exit because Greeks always sound like they're arguing. Like if you don't understand the Greek language, they always sound like they're arguing. And that's because they're very passionate. And when you look at the history of Greece, Greece is a country that ceased to exist for centuries. And that Greece was able to it was able to gain independence from the Ottoman Empire and regain a cultural identity, for all the problems Greece has today. The fact that Greece was able to maintain their a cultural identity and come into their own again after so many centuries, that's self-assertion.
Mhm.
That's that big, passionate, self-expressive energy of survival. And we often misinterpret that self-assertion as aggression, as an attack, because we're just not used to it.
How do you bring these concepts into radical relating? So if your readers are wanting to really focus in on these concepts, focus in on perfecting their conflict intimacy, they pick up your book. How do you try and lead them through the path that they want to walk down?
Yeah. So I take a trauma-informed approach.
Okay.
And I talk about 4 pillars of trauma-informed relating. So these are values and principles and practices that ground us so that we can be more aware of what's happening in ourselves and in others. So the first principle is orienting. So that is literally taking in the lay of the land, looking around you, paying attention to what's happening in your body, paying attention to what's happening outside of you. Very often we have to slow down to do that. Um, the second principle is healing or resolution. So we're looking to find resolution for the things from the past that may have caused us pain that may still be interfering with the present moment. So very often, when you're in conflict, there may be a part of you that's like time traveling and going back to like, oh, this is like when I was a kid and my parents would say this, or that teacher would say that, or this is the same argument we've been in for 20 years. And why are we back at this place? Right. Very often, when we're stuck in these cycles, it's because there's some piece of resolution that didn't get to happen. For many of us, that does come from childhood because as children, we didn't have permission for agency, right? We may not even had a sense of our own self agency. There may be things that were even pre-verbal that we're time traveling back to when we get into stressful experiences. So we want to explore like how do we engage in such a way that we are aware of that and also seeking to resolve that.
How
Um,
does, before we get into the third pillar, I want to stop on that second. I find that fascinating, especially how does the concept of epigenetic trauma inform your approach? I mean, if you're talking about being
yeah,
Greek, being Romani, I mean, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but given what little you've told me about your background, I mean, we're talking about, Greek genocide, Romani genocide. I mean, there's just so much epigenetic trauma built in not only to your personal story, but many people's, many, especially, immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers.
yeah.
So how do you incorporate the idea of epigenetic trauma into your practices of healing and resolution?
So one of the biggest traumas that people experience through displacement is the loss of community, right? And that's not just the loss of community with other people, that's the loss of the community relationship you have with the land. Going back to that attachment experience, we don't just experience attachment between human beings, we experience attachment with the land. And you look at, all the displaced peoples around the world, you look at indigenous peoples in North America, you look at the people of Palestine and Gaza, like everyone talks about their relationship to the land is as important as their relationship to each other as human beings. Their relationship to the animals, to the rivers, to the lakes, to the oceans, like all of this is important. And so when we are displaced, there's an epigenetic trauma of the loss of relationship. So one of the biggest pieces is coming back into relationship. So we might come back into relationship, and polyamory might be a strategy for that,
Oh, interesting.
right?
Yeah.
And it's not the only strategy for that. You could have other strategies for coming back into relationship.
But insisting on monogamy to the exclusion of any other strategy is unnecessarily restricting, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. And just to be clear, like someone could have a functionally monogamous relationship as a conscious choice, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean that they cut off their relationships with their wider community, right? You might say, "Well, what works for me, I don't need to have sex with more people. I don't need to experience raising kids with more people or anything like that." But you could still have emotional intimacy with your dear friends. And in some definitions of monogamy, that wouldn't be okay, right? But, you might be like, "Yeah, I love
An
my buddies."
emotional affair, as they say.
Yes, exactly. And and so, yeah, it's possible to do that still in a monogamous relationship.
It's very interesting. I cut you off before you got to the third and fourth pillar.
Yeah, so the third pillar is about resilience. And so this is about we go beyond our comfort zone and then we come back. So very often we think of resilience as endurance, I think. And endurance is like I'm going to tough it out. And the metaphor I use for this is like having a pebble in your shoe. Oh, I got a pebble in my shoe. It's all right. It's no big deal. I'll just keep going. And as you go, you keep walking with a pebble in your shoe every day, you're going to get a blister. And once you have that blister, you cannot walk anymore. You have to like take your shoes off, you have to get bandaged up. It's very painful. But that's not resilience. Resilience is noticing when you're at your edge and coming back away from it a little bit and going, how can I be more resourced to go to my edge? Resilience is also in the support we receive around us. So when we look at like doing scary things, um, and this is again, like I think migration experiences come into play here. Someone who's moving to a new country completely alone has less resourcing and they may find resilience through connecting with communities of people who are just like them. People who are exploring non-monogamy, there's often there's a lot of social misunderstandings and there's stigma and you can face difficulties with your family of origin and even work and so forth. And there's a lot of resilience to be found in connecting with other people who've done this path too. I think resilience can also come through, connecting with our elders and, having more intergenerational friendships and mentorships too. And
Which
all of that is
21st century North American culture makes incredibly difficult and seeks to atomize and prevent as much as possible.
exactly. And it's about like what resilience is really about is how we expand our capacity. And I think in Western culture, we the individualism that we experience tells us we have to be completely self-reliant. And I think, yes, I think we should be self-responsible as much as possible. And also, it's okay if what you need to support you is the capacity of the greater community.
Yeah, but see, that's an inherent challenge to capitalism. See,
Yeah.
this is where we start threatening, or where you and your work starts threatening the power structure. Because
This
if
is
we
where they don't
go
like the
This is
anarchists.
where they don't like the anarchists. And maybe this is a good place that you can work in the concept of relationship anarchy. I don't know if that applies at all, but
Oh,
it
yeah.
strikes me that if a writer and a thinker like you is hammering away at the intellectual and emotional foundations of monogamy, which include this idea that the best, quote unquote, and the highest, quote unquote, state for the person is as an individual with individual striving, then necessarily any sort of communitarian, any sort of pluralistic, any sort of even culturally non-monogamistic practice becomes very threatening to the economic foundation of the culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it does. I mean, I I s I like to think of it as that, we have this tapestry that is woven in society of colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy and all these things, right? It's a big old web. And compulsory monogamy is one of those threads. You can undo that tapestry by starting on any of those threads, right? You can pull on any of them. The thread that I'm pulling on is compulsory monogamy. And as I pull on it, I get to all the other pieces too.
That's so interesting, Mel, because you're not the first polyamorous author I've had on, but me as somebody who's practiced monogamy, I've sort of struggled to see where the tie-in is between polyamory and challenging monogamy
Mhm.
to the larger anarchistic practice. And that you're the first person that, no disrespect to any of my other friends and commentators, but you're really the first person that sort of made me see that it's part of this whole, as you said, that all of these independent threads you're talking about actually come together. I think that's so fascinating.
Well, and there's something about the ways that we're taught to relate that um, teach us to limit the way that we relate. And I've seen this really recently playing out in politics. And I hope it's okay to just talk about Zoran Mamdani for a
Are you
moment.
kidding? I've fucking Viva Zoran. I mean, that was the happiest I've been politically in a long time the other night.
Here's a man who has a lot of resilience, right? And we can analyze like, the privilege he's come from, the education. He's also a third culture kid. Like, he's bringing in so much that's fresh and new. But when I look at the videos when he's talking to people in the streets and also when he's talking up on stage, he's being relational.
And he's always smiling.
Yeah.
I noticed that about Mamdani. He's always smiling. When he goes into synagogues, when he goes into Zionist spaces to talk about why he is an anti-Zionist and why he's defending Gazans, he's smiling. And just
Yeah.
that right there, I think, speaks volumes about
Yeah.
him and his project.
And look at how he builds that relationality. I mean, from a somatic perspective, this is someone who's very connected to his ventral vagal nervous system, right? To go a bit sciencey, the ventral vagal nervous system is the part of our nervous system that invigorates our face, our chest. It also, invigorates some of our visceral organs. And it's when there's energy moving through there, we feel warm and we feel connected. It is the energy that we hopefully got from our parents. It's the energy that we hopefully get from our partners. And it's an energy that we have lost. Western society does not reward ventral vagal connection.
You know,
Western society rewards us being like in sympathetic activation, armored up, rah, 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 we got to go, go, go. And that's what's led us to this place. And again, like, a lot of activist movements, we are traumatized. We are desperately trying to survive under circumstances of trauma. And so of course we are in sympathetic activation. Of course we are in fight or flight. Of course we have that fire and spice coming through. And we can have that and also have that ventral vagal connection and also be relational. And that actually ties us into like that fourth pillar of trauma informed relationships with it, which is engagement. So in engagement, we're looking at how do we be embodied? How do we make this not just an intellectual experience, but a felt experience? Something that we can live and breathe in our bodies. And that's where somatic work comes in so useful. And somatics is just a modern term for practices that we've had for millennia around how we bring ourselves back into relationship with ourselves, how we resolve the trauma that we're holding from the past, whether it's through, doing some somatic therapy one-on-one or dancing together as a group or building something together or going for a run or whatever it is that allows you to move through it, right? And that embodiment piece is so deeply tied to how we bring in our relationality alongside all the other stuff that we're feeling.
and how, if somebody's picking up your book and they're saying, okay, I'm sold. I believe what Mel just said, and I believe their diagnosis of this problem. What do you say to a person? Because oftentimes the first step is the hardest step. So what do you say to the person who says, Mel, tell me how to take that first step towards engagement, towards becoming more resilient?
Yeah. The first step is knowing yourself. right? This is the core of it, because there are so many ways in which we've been told who we are, right? Our parents tell us who we are. Our schools tell us who we are. We have our peers tell us who we are. We're told who we are allowed to be. And that does not necessarily correlate with who you actually are. And this is why the book is also queer wisdom, because I think when you've gone through the experience of unpacking your own queerness, if that is who you are, you've had a taste of going, well, who am I really? Am I the way that other people have told me I am? Am I the gender I was assigned? Is my orientation straight? Like, is that true of me? And I think we can expand that layer of questioning in terms of, like, why do I do the things I do? Why do I seek out relationships? What is it that I'm looking to get from relationships? How am I measuring the success and health of my relationships? Where do I dream of these relationships taking me? Like, these are the first pieces of inquiry we want to do, because unless you know the answers to those questions, what, why, where, how, then you're gonna be kind of stumbling around in the dark. And sometimes we don't know the answer, and it's okay, and it's like, "Okay, well, let's explore one direction, and then we get more information, and maybe then we know." But to explore knowing that you're doing this as an exploration to figure it out, I think is very important, because then that's being, I think, a little more fair to everybody else.
We're running up on an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I don't want you to go without telling our audience a little bit more about what you mean by your self-identification as a relationship anarchist. I think
Yeah.
our listeners who know Seeds of Revolution and fans of Camus would be very curious about that concept.
Yeah, so relationship anarchy as a term came about in like the 90s or so. And it's came about because people were going, how do we apply the principles of anarchism into the way that we're doing relationships? You know, when we're looking at deconstructing um, power systems that seek to hoard power, and we're doing that socially and economically and politically, why are we still hoarding our relationships intimately? And so relationship anarchy came about as this response of like, yeah, let's apply these principles. So in relationship anarchy, you're not centering the intimate romantic relationships as being the most important. You might treat your friendships on equal with those romantic relationships. You know, if there is a kind of hierarchy, it's a one of necessity and priority of like the kids come first, or my partner's sick in hospital, so I'm going to be like focusing more on them for a while, right? And so in relationship anarchy, we're really looking at how do we redistribute the power dynamics that can happen within a relationship? How are we mindful of them? And I think seeking to counter where there might be too much power hoarding, and looking at creating equity, but also an equity that allows everyone to be themselves. You know, again, going back to some of the, the reasons past communes have failed. You know, the Carista commune in the 70s in California, they really tried to do enforced equity, and it didn't work.
It sounds like a bad idea from the get-go. When you start
Yeah.
off forced, you're really courting disaster.
So with relationship anarchy, there's a it's an experience of interdependence when it works. It's not the same as just fucking around. And I think some people will fuck around and call it relationship anarchy. And I'm like, no, that's just relationship chaos. Or maybe that's relationship libertarianism. But
Maybe that's
you
being
know,
selfish and narcissistic and wanting an
hey,
excuse.
yeah, sure. And I think, relationship anarchy at its core is really about, reconfiguring the way that we see relationships, that we are part of a whole ecosystem. And that is what it is for me. I have an ecosystem of relationships. Some of these relationships are social, some are erotic, some are emotional, some are practical. Where they sit in that landscape doesn't signify that they're more important or less important to me. What matters is the quality of connection. And a relationship can move between these different quadrants, um, and can change form. And that is, it is okay for it to change form. I'm not holding on to it as like, this is this is my whole identity now.
Mel, you've given me quite an education in the last hour. I really, really appreciate it. And I want to please beg and tell our listeners both to go out and buy Mel's book, Radical Relating, a queer and polyamory-informed guide to love beyond the myth of monogamy. You can get it lots of places. I would prefer you got it at Camus Books. We are located in beautiful Victoria. We are a proud anarchist co-op bookshop that happily has plenty of copies of Mel's books if you want to drop by and come get one. Mel, thank you so much for being on Seeds of Revolution and sharing your thoughts and your work with me and our audience. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Joel.
Back today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what